They had differences in age, ethnicity, previous marital status. One of them had kids from a previous relationship. The other one didn't. One of them, this was their second marriage. The other one, this was their first marriage. They had differences in socioeconomic backgrounds. One was white collar, one was blue collar, and there were others. And when I just looked at all of that, I'm like, wow, that is a lot to overcome. Marriage is already hard. When you have that many factors to overcome, it's just not likely to succeed. Hello again. Welcome to The Ruthless Truth. I am your host, Truth Davis. And in this forum, we discuss a wide range of topics, opinions, truths, based on what I believe to be a unique life experience. And you can read more details about that in the bio or in the notes. So, general format, I might offer some opinion on current trends today, then go deep on today's truth, the topic we want to discuss more about, and then I'll finish with American history fun fact. Okay, one observation. There are still people who are losing weight via diet and exercise. Just taking a disciplined, long-term, patient approach and happy with losing 1 to 2 pounds a week. And I feel bad for them because in today's environment, if you achieve any significant weight loss, everybody just assumes you're on the shot. I'm old enough to remember when people lost weight, they were celebrated and received accolades. And what that does is just give you even more motivation and resolve to keep going. But now, these same people are on the defensive. They have to explain and convince people, no, I'm just working hard. And until recently, that was understood. For the previous 100 years, everyone knew significant weight loss occurred in one of 3 ways: diet, exercise, or disease. And this shift has happened so quickly. These GLP-1 drugs like Ozempic and Wegovy, they've really only been around in the last 5 to 7 years. Now, since they've been around, the use of these drugs has exploded, with prescriptions increasing 300% between 2018 and 2023. But again, that's recent. So I just want to continue to champion and celebrate the folks who are just focused on diet and exercise. Now, by no means am I judging or shaming the people who are on the shot, but I must confess, I am a little bit more impressed with the people who are doing it the old-fashioned way. Just one guy's opinion. Okay, let's get to today's truth. I recently received some feedback from one of my young listeners, and what she said was, you say that you're going to talk about a broad range of topics, not including sports or politics. She said, but to date, it really hasn't been that broad because it seems like a lot of your content has been focused on your corporate America experience. I had to think about that and go, she's right. And she said, now, why I find it interesting and I find the stories enjoyable, if not as relatable to me, because I'm in healthcare and in my 20s. So, let me know if there's some other topics that you'd like to talk about. And so I guess in a way she kind of called me out. And so that's what we're going to do today. So today's truth is about building and maintaining long-lasting relationships, okay? And let's start with a painfully, ridiculously obvious statement. Building and maintaining long-term relationships, long-lasting relationships, is hard. Yep, call me Captain Obvious. It's hard. It's very hard. That's why you see less and less of it. Now, I'm not going to limit this discussion to just marital relationships because there are many couples in long, productive, positive relationships who aren't married, don't intend to get married, and maybe in some places aren't even able to get married. In a previous episode, I talked specifically about the benefits of marriage. So I'm not going to revisit that here. But while I talked about the practical benefits of marriage, I didn't really say anything about how to get into those relationships. Okay, so just some basic assumptions to start. I'm going to assume the basic elements are of being attracted to each other and enjoy spending time together. Just is how relationships start. But I say that because we've all had dates or situations with people we were initially attracted to, but then after spending some time with them, realize, maybe I don't want to spend that much time with them for whatever reason. And when I say enjoy spending time together, that doesn't mean always going out or having something fun to do. I vividly remember a situation with my wife during our engagement. I was watching March Madness and she was reading a book. We were in her apartment. And then after a while, I just said, hey, you want to go out to lunch? You want to go get something to eat? And she's like, no, I'm fine. I was like, oh, okay. And then more time goes by. And then later I said, hey, you want to go see a movie? And she's like, no, not really. There's nothing right now I really want to go see. I'm fine. I was like, okay. A little bit more time goes by. I just had to ask, is something wrong? Are you mad about something? And she just put the book down and said, look, we have to get used to doing nothing together because most of the time in our relationship, that's what we're going to be doing. Nothing. I was like, oh, okay. Got it. So, what are the keys to staying together for a while? Well, there's definitely no one right answer. I think I can share a few guidelines based on tons of research, observation, and then my only personal experience. Okay, so one of the first keys of building a long relationship is having realistic expectations from the beginning. Okay? Your partner and you are not going to agree on everything. None of us are perfect. And so each of us made some trade-offs or compromises coming into the relationship. There are going to be up and downs. There are going to be arguments. You may even have days when you don't like each other and you don't even want to be around each other. Okay. But you just have to recognize, and those things are going to happen. They're probably going to be infrequent. And you should definitely have more good days than bad days. All right. So just know it's not going to be smooth sailing the whole time. And while you are part of a couple and you are a unit, you're each still two individuals. Being with someone doesn't mean you need to stop being who you are as an individual. And if you feel you need to continue to make changes to who you are to a point that you almost don't recognize who you are, then you're probably in the wrong relationship. It shouldn't be that hard. And related to my previous point about being individuals, you don't have to spend all your free time together. Okay? I know it sounds cliche, but me time, not only healthy, I would argue that it is a requirement of a relationship. Now, while I'm sure the two of you probably have common interests, you don't have identical interests. If I like horror movies and you don't, why should I expect you to go to the movies with me when I know you're not going to enjoy it? Some couples even take separate vacations. I get this. I'd only say that it should be the exception more than the rule. Another thing about relationships that last for a while is, how do you fight? And what I would say is, try to fight fair. Very early in my dating career, I was somewhat cynical. I actually had a saying that I love you means you can hurt me now. Now, thankfully, I grew out of this negative frame of mind, but don't lose sight of the point. The people closest to you can hurt you the most. So when you get into an argument with your partner, avoid trying to be hurtful because you know how to do it. But if you really love them, you should never want to see them hurt and in pain, and especially by your own hand. That said, it might still happen, but if it does, just own up to it, acknowledge it, apologize profusely, and try very hard not to do it again, because those are the most painful episodes. All right, what else? Well, focus on the big stuff that's going to matter for years, and don't sweat the small stuff or temporary or short-term issues. And let me give you one of the best examples. Weddings, okay? It is an empirical and undeniable fact. The more money you spend on your wedding, the higher the likelihood your marriage will not last. Okay, that's just a fact. And people ask, well, why is that? Well, if you think about it, it's pretty straightforward. Because if you have a big wedding and you're spending a lot of time and money on the wedding, you could be spending up to a year just focused on this one day, instead of spending your time discussing and figuring out how you're going to live together after that one day. And so there's a letdown, and then you're actually behind in how you kind of build and learn how to build your lives together. Another element of long-lasting relationships, compatible intimacy. Compatible, key word here. Sex and intimacy are important, all right? I mean, to be clear, this alone is not enough of a reason to stay in a relationship or sustain a relationship, but it is a factor. I mean, there are 168 hours in a week. So even if you're hot and heavy, 2 hours a day, there's still 154 hours left in the week. There's got to be something else there, to hold you. That said, it's still important. And people have a wide-ranging sexual interest, and I don't judge in any way. The only thing that matters is what works for you. Still, effort, communication is a requirement. You know what you like. And you probably need to invest some time and talk to make sure you understand what your partner likes. And it's okay to have some differences. But if you know you're freaky AF, freaky as F, then you probably need to get somebody who's also freaky. Because, again, if the differences are incompatible, unless there's some willingness to change, it's probably not going to work. Or it's going to lead to resentment, dissatisfaction, and potentially creeping. All right. Another factor to consider in a long-lasting relationship, non-conflicting religious beliefs. Now, this is becoming less and less of a factor as church attendance in this country is at an all-time low. I mean, specifically, 49% of adults say they never or rarely attend religious services. Still, it's potentially an issue if one person is deeply religious and the other one is not, or even worse, they're both deeply religious and those religious beliefs have significant conflicts. Not necessarily a deal breaker, but it requires conversations. Okay? All right. Money. Need to have some common views on money. And money, by the way, always ranks in the top 3 reasons of why, married couples divorce. But it can also be an issue even in the early part of dating when you're deciding, how are we going to spend our leisure time? What do you want to do? I can tell you right now, if you got one person who is a spender and one person is a saver, it's not going to work. Now, that doesn't mean you have to share every view of money. I'll give you an example. Well, my wife and I are of similar mind when it comes to saving and investing. We have very different ideas about how money needs to be managed. I mean, specifically, she meticulously writes down and tracks every dollar she spends. She actually balances her checkbook at the end of the month by hand in a check ledger. I've never written down a check in my life, okay? And I'm also not that big on budgeting. So how do we resolve these differences? Well, you got to find out what works for you. But what works for us All our money is separate. We have no shared checking accounts, no shared savings accounts, no shared credit cards. We have separate brokerage accounts. We even have different financial advisors. That way, neither of us has to answer to the other one any questions about what we're doing with our money or having to justify, like, hey, I wanted to buy a new suit. And before you dismiss this saying by, well, you guys have had a long time to accommodate assets that allow you to do this. Yeah. Well, when we made this decision to separate our finances? 3 months after we got married. Yeah, we had only been living together 90 days before we realized, hey, this isn't going to work. Okay. And we had nothing. So we just had to recognize that this was going to be a conflict. Let's go ahead and eliminate it early so you don't have to deal with it forever. All right. And the final piece I'll mention as far as factors to building and sustaining a long-lasting relationship is communication. And it may very well be the most important. You've got to establish effective ways to communicate with each other. And I'm not just talking about how was your day or being able to talk about what our plans are for the weekend. All right. If you have something to say it. If something is bothering you, express it. If you have a concern or something about what the other person's doing or you feel is not being addressed, then just say it. Now, that may be oversimplified. You'll have to figure out the best way to convey your thoughts and feelings based on your knowledge and understanding of yourself and also of your partner, how they listen, what's the best way to talk to them, what's the best time to talk to them. And you'll probably stumble a few times, but it's really important, and communication is the burden of the communicator. So if you're trying to communicate and they aren't getting what you're saying, that's not their problem. It's your problem to go back, rethink about it, and come back and make sure that you're conveying what you want to say. And the other thing about it is it never ends. It never ends. That is something that you'll continue to work on as long as you are a couple. Okay. So that was just kind of a brief discussion list of key factors in building and maintaining a relationship. Now, I want to talk about headwinds. And what I mean by headwinds, I'm talking about there's some factors that if they exist in your relationship or at the beginning of your relationship, they're just going to make it that much harder for the relationship to work. No matter how hard you try and how bad you want it to work, certain factors are going to make it harder. Some people like to say love conquers all, meaning if we really love each other, we can overcome anything. And that is a really nice, sweet thought. It's just not realistic. Sometimes love is not enough to overcome everything. And there are many well-intended relationships fail because of some of these headwinds. So I just want to look at a few of them. The first one is age. All right. I know a lot of people believe age is just a number and that a large age gap in a relationship doesn't matter. Well, it really does. The larger the age gap, the less likely the relationship will last long term. That's just a fact. Now, we all know exceptions. We all know couples who have big age groups and been together forever. Okay? And they do fine. And it's really not as common as you might think. 75% of relationships, the two partners are within 5 years of each other either way. But once the age gap gets beyond 10 years, the likelihood of a long-lasting relationship decreases. It's just a fact. Another headwind is if there are kids from previous marriages. Now, this is something that is far more common. If one or especially as people get older, if one or both partners had kids from a previous relationship, it just places an additional strain on the relationship. Now, people work through it all the time. Like I said, it's common. All I'm saying is it makes it harder. And then the last one I'll point to as far as headwinds is interracial. To this point, I've talked about relationships independent of whether there's marital status, but for this headwind, the only statistics and data I have was researched on marriage couples, so I apologize for that. Interracial couples have a higher divorce rate than couples of the same race. Okay? Now, regardless of what you see depicted on television commercials, it's actually not that common. Only 19% of marriages are interracial. But these couples do carry a heavier burden in most situations, and mainly because of external things like societal or family pressures. And then if they choose to have children, there's sometimes a challenge in striking a balance between not only raising biracial kids, but also bicultural kids, if there could be significant difference on that factor between partners. Okay? All right. I didn't want to spend a lot of time on headwinds, but that's 3 of the most common and the biggest ones. And again, I'm not saying the existence of these headwinds is a reason for people not together if they really want to spend time together. What I'm saying is just recognize that these factors are real. And to stay together is going to require more work with that couple than if these factors were not in place. You know, I was recently out having drinks with a couple friends of mine. We all initially met at work, and we've maintained our friendships, you know, long after we left the place where we worked and we moved on to other places. Okay. So after we ordered our second round of drinks, Jeremy told me he had an announcement. He and his wife were in the process of divorcing. And before I could take it all in, Maria says to me, "So you owe me $50. And now Jeremy's confused. And then she explained, we had a bet that your marriage wouldn't last 4 years, and I just won. So then Jerry looked at me and asked, "You guys made a bet on my marriage? When'd you make this bet?" And then we both started looking at each other nervously. And then I finally spoke up and said, at your reception. He's like, "What?" I say, "Look, I know you and your wife were really in love and you all made a really beautiful couple. But man, there were just way too many headwinds to overcome. They had differences in age, ethnicity, previous marital status. One of them had kids from a previous relationship. The other one didn't. One of them, this was their second marriage. The other one, this was their first marriage. They had differences in socioeconomic backgrounds. You know, one was white collar, one was blue collar, and there were others. And when I just looked at all of that, I'm like, wow, that is a lot to overcome. Marriage is already hard. When you have that many factors to overcome, it's just not likely to succeed." Okay, let's get to today's American history fun fact. And the subject for today is Prohibition. Now, I'm sure almost everyone is aware of the Prohibition period in U.S. history. The 18th Amendment established the prohibition of alcohol in the United States and was ratified on January 16, 1919. Alcohol remained illegal until 1933, when the 21st Amendment repealed the 18th Amendment. But what was life really like during Prohibition? How successful was the government in eliminating drinking in the U.S.? Well, let's take a quick look. First, let's start with the actual language of the amendment. Here's how it read. "After 1 year from the ratification of this article, the manufacture, sale, or transportation of intoxicating liquors is hereby prohibited." Okay. A few points about that language. Now, it clearly says it's illegal to make, sell, or distribute alcohol. But you know what it doesn't say? It doesn't say it's illegal to possess or consume alcohol. Also, while it was ratified in 1919, Prohibition wouldn't go into effect until 1 year later. So what happened? Well, the first thing, people who had money spent the entire year of 1919 stockpiling liquor before it became illegal. And then after 1920, when it was illegal, drinking clubs and speakeasies opened up where people could gather and drink. Again, it wasn't illegal to consume alcohol. Now, there were debates and legislation active at the state level to determine whether or not prohibition was only for distilled spirits, meaning it didn't include beer and wine. And in some states, those efforts were successful and beer and wine were excluded. Also, historically, to that point, alcohol was widely prescribed for medicinal purposes. So the medical profession successfully lobbied Congress to allow for exceptions and the right to prescribe alcohol, which resulted in tens of millions of dollars of alcohol prescriptions. Finally, enforcement was kind of lax, especially in some of your big cities where there were other things to worry about. Now, even with all of that, there was still a marked decrease in alcohol consumption in the U.S. during the Prohibition period. There was a reduction in alcohol-related ailments such as cirrhosis. Now, on crime, that impact was a little bit of a mixed bag. So there were fewer crimes that otherwise would have been committed by intoxicated individuals, such as assault. But then new crimes emerged such as bootlegging and rum running. Organized crime and the mob thrived. So by 1933, the nation had had enough, passed the 21st Amendment, repealing prohibition. So are there any lessons to be learned from this failed experiment? Well, I think there are a couple. First, never underestimate the power of a movement, okay? The temperance movement had been around for decades, and most people just kind of dismissed it and never thought anything would come of it. But following World War I, they gained some momentum, and next thing you know, bam, we got prohibition. The second lesson is whether legal or not, people are going to drink and people are going to get high. So it may be better off having it legislated. Okay. That's all I have today for The Ruthless Truth. Thank you so much for listening. You can engage on social media via Instagram, Truth Davis 5, Facebook, Ruthless Truth, and truthdavis.com. Also, the YouTube channel launched last week, which is also Ruthless Truth. Thanks again, and I will talk with you soon.